Right, so I suppose it was a foregone conclusion that with Keir Starmer now as Prime Minister, leading what I've seen called his sandcastle government, essentially because that is what his majority is built on, that Tony Blair would crawl out of whatever fetid pit of damnation he happened to be occupying since his last rare intervention. But those interventions might now start to become a lot less rare, alas. Opining at a speech yesterday as he was at his own Tony Blair Institute on the unsustainability of the number of sick and disabled people in this country, was also musing that the best way to head off the threat of the far right, like Nigel Farage's Reform UK, is to be more like them. Not so much a Labour government that is Tory-lite, but, well, racist-lite, it seems.
We have some deep structural health problems. There are rising numbers of long-term sick of working age, big increases in disability benefits, and in mental health spending. So we have an unsustainable situation.
Right, so that was a short clip of Tony Blair there, as if we could possibly mistake him for anyone else, making a speech yesterday at the Future of Britain conference being held at the Tony Blair Institute. So of course he was going to be there as well, giving his opinions, making a speech, and plenty of other Labour figures were as well. Another notable clip doing the rounds on social media was of Wes Streeting, now the Health Secretary, proudly boasting that his Department of Health and Social Care and the NHS itself is no longer a public service, but is now an economic growth department. So pray tell, what are you going to be selling off or charging for in order to generate a profit out of our health service? And Wes, is it going to be the growth of our economy, or, I don't know, just the economic growth happening in shareholder wallets? We've seen this play before. You're not doing anything different to the Tories. It's more privatisation, more outsourcing, more of the NHS budget ending up in private pockets. But anyway, back to Blair. Standing there in that piece of footage, Blair, an insanely rich man whose hands will never wash clean of the blood of a million dead Iraqis, appears to be saying that Labour should be coming for the long-term sick and disabled next, along with those with mental health issues, because why not include them too if you're going to go down this road? Are these people and their families, their carers, not suffered enough? This is a soapbox I will never get off, because this is personal. This is my own family he could be talking about, a carer as I am to two disabled family members. But equally, so many other families around this country, some of whom sadly have lost family members at the hands of Tory disability and social security reforms. Blair calls these issues, though, unsustainable. But it's not like those affected have a choice about that, is it, Tony? You have the choice to inflict your opinions on us from a stage at your own think tank, about as welcome as a dose of the clap as they are. But people suffering the long-term effects, for example, of long COVID, have no choice but to suffer from that. For those where Tory Britain and struggling to get by, living in it for so long, failure in government as that was, something I'm sure you'd agree with, even if you'd basically do very little different, eroding people's mental health and the dearth of NHS support to deal with it at the same time. It's not the fault of the sufferer. It can never be levied at their fault. And disability can come for us all. We could get hit by a bus tomorrow. We could have some sort of a life-changing injury. We could come down with some awful life-limiting disease. And here we have a very wealthy man, a man whose wealth in no small part stems from his time in government as Prime Minister, and following that as a peace envoy, telling us that those whose health has failed or is failing them are essentially failing the economy for everybody else. Well, according to the government's own website, social security spending for the year 2024-25 is forecast to be £305.6 billion. That seems an insane amount of money, doesn't it? 11% of GDP, in fact. And I'm sure Blair would point at that and say it proves his point. But 55% of that is the state pension and pension credit. If you consider the state pension to be a benefit, nonetheless, it is legislated as such and is treated as such by government, since people pay in all their lives to get it. It's something they earn in a lot of people's heads, and I wouldn't disagree with that notion. Yet a benefit is very much how it is treated, and very much the largest part of what passes for their welfare bill. £168 billion of it, in fact. In fact, if that were sufficient, that state pension, then pension credit, which is part of that bill as well, wouldn't even be needed. But because we have such a measly pension in the UK compared to other countries, unfortunately it needs a top-up for some. Of the rest of the bill, 138 billion is on working age and child benefits. As we know that Starmer is none too keen to bring children out of poverty. This can, of course, include, though, universal credit for people who are working. So this isn't as simple as pointing at these people and saying they aren't working and that paying these benefits is unsustainable. That's not true. And I note Blair doesn't point the finger at in-work benefits at all. But ultimately, if their wages were higher, they wouldn't need the top-up, would they? Low wages, I would argue, is what is actually unsustainable here. And then there is £89 billion for disabled benefits and £35.9 billion on housing benefit. Imagine how much of that you could save if you brought in rent caps, for example, with all those landlord Labour MPs. Oh, you'd never get that passed, would you, Keir Starmer? Now, if Blair weren't the walking, talking equivalent of bile rising in our throats, if he actually meant to talk about what is truly unsustainable, instead of putting the fear of God yet again into the disabled and the long-term sick and those suffering from mental health issues, many of those mental health issues in due part to 14 years of Tory rule doing the same thing, then he might consider something like tax avoidance, for example. How about instead of attacking the disabled, we talk about tax havens instead, Tony? As for that disability benefit bill, 47% claiming it are also pensioners. Are they unsustainable now as well because they claim that? Where will this conversation end up leading? I think we know before. History told us, hasn't it? Bearing in mind those figures I just quoted, though, a report by Tax Justice from 2022, and let's face it, the Tories haven't dealt with this in the 2 years since, so this is likely even bigger now, but in 2022 they quoted the amount of money being held in tax havens by British citizens to amount to a staggering £570 billion. That's an enormous figure. That's ridiculous. But so will be the lost tax revenue on that money as well. If you're wealthy enough to be able to use such schemes, then you're wealthy enough to pay more in the economy, but they don't contribute to the economy at all, do they, Tony? And you, after all, would know, wouldn't you? People might recall the leaking of the so-called Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers. I think they ran out of P words after that, or we're still waiting for the next lot to come out, I dare say, relating to tax havens, of course, as they were. Blair himself was mentioned in the Pandora Papers, having bought a company based in a tax haven in order to secure a property he wanted, and in doing it that way avoided over £300,000 in stamp duty. People like you, Tony Blair, are what this country cannot afford, therefore. Because for as much as you attack the long-term sick and disabled, what they get, they spend in the economy. Their money works for a living, if you like. That drives the economy. People spending drives the economy. That is what promotes economic growth, strengthens the economy. More money in ordinary people's pocket who actually go out and spend it is the best thing any government can do to drive the economy. That isn't going to happen under Starmer's Labour, carrying on with the Tories left off, with wealthy donors who don't spend in the economy, who just put all their money into a big fat bank account and leave it there to wither and die, backing them. Choosing to buy policy in effect rather than contribute to the economy properly themselves, and Blair is singing from a hymn sheet they might as well have written. Blair has also weighed in with advice, let's call it, for Keir Starmer, because of course he has. One of the things we observed during the general election, and for years frankly leading up to it, was Starmer trying to appeal to Tories for their votes. Whilst he may have gained some by losing a great deal of others, it was figured that would stick by him, he ended up getting fewer votes despite winning a majority at the recent general election. But given the Tories lost 20% of their vote share and Labour didn't even gain another 2%, clearly most Tory votes didn't go to Labour. They went for the way of places like Reform UK. Blair's advice to Starmer, helpfully platformed in The Guardian, because of course that's who published it, go even further right. Yes, send Starmer even further right, as if he hasn't gone enough that way already. Nothing like centrists to enable the far right, is there? Although Blair still believes in making the case for good migration, because all these migrants crossing the channel blamed for so long for the nation ills wrongly, please see the aforementioned point on tax havens again if you dispute that, but the grievance is there. The favourite target of the far right populist, and of course Starmer thinks he can stop the vote with his new border command force, now that he's redeployed the money for Rwanda into that service. But again, you can stick as many boats in the water as you like. Those crossings will still be attempted, and the only way you will do away with that and put the people traffickers out of business is to have a legal, safe route to claim asylum again. The last one of those we had, Tony Blair slammed the door on when he was PM. But not only that, but it is incidents of war like Iraq, but equally other conflicts we have been involved in as well as a country like Afghanistan or Libya. Now we're cocking around in the Middle East again as well, that create refugees. And then when they turn up on our doorsteps, we complain about it. How about we stop adding to the problem as well as deal with it as we need to and as we should, and treat these people like people? I'd also hesitate if I was Keir Starmer to take advice on tackling the far right from Blair, given that by the time he quit as PM in 2007, by 2008, 10 months later this was, the BNP were one of the fastest growing parties in the country, winning 100 councillors in that year's local elections, and in 2009 won 2 MEPs. He didn't tackle the far right. He left a vacuum for them to occupy. He enabled it. And of course that is a conversation being had here and now with regards to Starmer already. And the Labour right, again, that if he doesn't actually show he can deliver the change he promises to the country, then the door to the far right will be opened even wider than Blair left it. And while Tony Blair encourages Starmer to see off populists on the far right over migration by becoming more like them, less Tory-lite, more racist-lite, as I said earlier, he's happy enough to invoke that same populism to attack the long-term sick, disabled and people with mental health issues, just as the Tories have been doing for years now. This isn't the language of a party or a government which will help and solve these crises. When one of their grandees, as despised as he is every time he rears his head, who loves the sound of his own voice far too much, can also demonstrate such hypocrisy and be so utterly, completely and venomously wrong on every point. Meanwhile, a service that absolutely would help some of those people currently on sickness benefits get back into work would be to get whatever treatment they are waiting for expedited. Sadly, with Streeting crowing about running the NHS for some kind of profit to promote an economic return, and the appointment of Blair's old health minister, who subscribes to the NHS belief that it needs to privatise or perish, that very much doesn't look to be on the cards. Find out about that problem in the making in this video recommendation here, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.